Imagine a time when the happiness of an American family was not measured by a digital recommendation algorithm, but the physical weight of a blue plastic case and the unmistakable aroma of microwave popcorn and industrial carpet. For nearly 30 years, Blockbuster Video was not just a retail chain, it was the cultural nervous system of the suburbs, a $5 billion titan that held a monopoly over a nation's leisure time, dictating which stories would be told in living rooms from coast to coast. Today, the iconic blue and yellow facades that once anchored every elite shopping center have become hollowed-out carcasses, peeling monuments to an empire that possessed the data, the customers, and the logistics to dominate the future, but through pure hubris chose to laugh at its own execution. This is not just a story of a rental store that failed because of the internet. It is a clinical investigation into how operational greed and strategic myopia transformed the world's largest entertainment retailer into a case study of corporate suicide. The DNA of this tragedy began in 1985 in Dallas, Texas, with David Cook, a man who did not come from the world of cinema, but from the management of oil industry databases. Cook realized what small mom-and-pop family video stores ignored. Video rental was, at its heart, a game of inventory management and logistical efficiency. By introducing barcodes and a centralized computer system that tracked every tape in real time, Cook transformed entertainment chaos into a predictable household utility. The Blockbuster model was a machine of technical precision, ensuring that Hollywood's major releases were always available through a scale of purchasing that crushed any local competitor. It was the birth of the superstore model, a promise of guaranteed returns that built near-religious brand loyalty, transforming the act of renting a movie into an extension of the American middle-class dream, where the blue ticket was the passport to refuge from the everyday. To understand Blockbuster's technical mastery at its peak, one must analyze the economic engineering behind its greatest source of profit and, simultaneously, its greatest vulnerability, the late fees model. By the late 1990s, late fees were not just an operational detail. They represented approximately $800 million annually, or nearly 16% of the company's total revenue. Technically, Blockbuster had created a passive predatory business model where profitability depended directly on the inconvenience and forgetfulness of its own customer. It was brilliant financial engineering in the short term, but corrosive to brand value in the long term, as every dollar of profit generated by a fine was a gram of resentment injected into the soul of the consumer. This retail god complex created a dangerous comfort zone in the Dallas boardrooms, where executives came to believe that customers were tethered to the physical convenience of the stores and that fines were an inevitable entry fee for modern entertainment. The first sign of the terminal pathology that would kill Blockbuster manifested as a red envelope and a silent meeting in the year 2000. John Antioco, the then CEO acclaimed for revitalizing the brand, received Reed Hastings in his office, the founder of a small startup called Netflix that was losing money sending DVDs through the mail. Hastings proposed a partnership, Netflix would handle Blockbuster's online presence for $50 million, integrating the physical world with the digital. According to eyewitness accounts, Blockbuster leadership nearly laughed Hastings out of the room. For the men in suits in Dallas, the idea that Americans would abandon the pleasure of walking through store aisles to wait for an envelope in the mail was technically absurd. They were trapped in the innovator's dilemma, where the massive success of physical stores and the addictive revenue of late fees made them allergic to the very technology destined to replace them. They didn't see a competitor. They saw a $50 million joke that 10 years later would be worth $50 billion. The murder weapon in Blockbuster's suicide was the merger and subsequent catastrophic spin-off from Viacom, orchestrated by Sumner Redstone. When Blockbuster was acquired by Viacom in 1994, it was a healthy cash flow machine. However, throughout the decade, Viacom used Blockbuster as a corporate ATM, draining billions in dividends to fund other acquisitions while neglecting the necessary investment in the transition from VHS to DVD and later to streaming. When Blockbuster was finally freed as an independent public company in 2004, it was launched into the sea with a billion-dollar anchor of toxic debt, exactly when it needed every penny to fight the digital threat. It was a maneuver of financial engineering that left the Titan unarmed, forcing the company to cut costs aggressively and degrade the store experience, turning them into landscapes of stained carpets and flickering fluorescent lights, while Netflix and Redbox began to encircle the castle. Financially, Blockbuster fell victim to a strategic paralysis known as fear cannibalization. In 2004, under late pressure from John Antioco, the company finally launched Blockbuster Online and later the revolutionary Total Access program, which allowed customers to rent movies online and exchange them at physical stores. Technically, it was the perfect clicks and bricks strategy that could have defeated Netflix. However, the cost of eliminating late fees to compete with digital was $200 million in immediate profit. The board of directors, led by activist investor Carl Icahn, panicked. They saw the drop in quarterly profits not as the cost of survival, but as a management failure. In one of the most disastrous decisions in corporate history, Antioco was fired and the store exchange program was sabotaged to protect traditional retail profit margins. They chose to save today's penny at the cost of tomorrow's billion, ignoring that the ground beneath their feet had already turned into digital quicksand. By mid-2008, the human cost of this neglect became impossible to ignore. Entering a Blockbuster store in this era was like visiting a decaying relic. The Blockbuster moment had become a moment of depression. Empty shelves of new releases due to disputes with studios, demotivated employees who knew the end was near, and a haunting silence where the energy of 1,000 families once buzzed. The company that had once employed 84,000 Americans and provided middle-class stability for generations was now closing hundreds of stores per quarter. The psychological impact on the American worker was profound. Blockbuster was the symbol of suburban permanence, an institution that should have been there forever, now being erased by a debt spreadsheet in a New York office. The tragedy was not just the loss of the stock price, but the evaporation of the industrial dream that market dominance was a shield against time. Blockbuster's technical failure to understand that its product was not the plastic tape but convenience is one of history's greatest ironies. They possessed the database of movie preferences for millions of homes long before Netflix created its first algorithm. They had the distribution points on every corner of America. But while Netflix built a culture of relentless user obsession and friction removal, Blockbuster was trapped in a culture of clinical cost-cutting and real estate asset protection. They viewed the website not as the future, but a low-margin threat to their high-overhead physical stores. When they finally attempted a serious digital strategy, the ground had moved and the blue ticket had been replaced by the Play Now button. The arrogance of believing the customer would always come back was the poison that paralyzed the giant's response while the world moved to on-demand consumption. The official end came not with a bang, but with a bankruptcy petition at 2 a.m. in September 2010. The filing revealed a staggering $1.1 billion debt and a workforce decimated from its peak of 60,000 to a fraction of that number. For many Americans over 50, the news was a personal blow. It was the final confirmation that the era of physical stability was over. The bankruptcy wiped out the savings of small investors and endangered the pensions of long-time employees, a final indignity for a workforce that gave their lives to a company they thought was too big to fail. Blockbuster had become the sacrificial lamb of retail, a $5 billion lesson that in the modern economy, history and emotional connection mean nothing against the cold math of a distressed asset play. In a final and bitter twist of fate, the final liquidation of the brand saw Blockbuster's rights bought by Dish Network, which tried to use the name for a failed streaming service before finally letting the brand wither until only a single store remained in Bend, Oregon. This surviving store today functions as a living museum, a brand ghost that attracts nostalgic tourists who want to smell the plastic one last time. There is a certain poetic tragedy in the fact that the subscription model Blockbuster ignored is now the dominant form of global commerce under the names of its former enemies. The giant that once held the keys to every American home has disappeared, replaced by a logo on retro T-shirts sold in department stores, a shadow of a brand that once meant security, quality, and the future. The technical autopsy of Blockbuster highlights a fundamental truth of the digital age. A brand is not its buildings, but its utility. Blockbuster thought it was in the business of renting tapes when it was actually in the business of leisure time management. When they stopped investing in convenience and started punishing their customers with fines and degraded stores, they broke the invisible contract they had with the American people. This misalignment meant every marketing campaign felt hollow and every promotion felt like a bribe to enter a dying world. They were a 20th century general trying to fight a satellite war with a horse and buggy supply line. The lesson for the modern investor is clear. No empire is too big to fall if it stops investing in its own soul and starts treating its customers as sources of finds instead of sources of inspiration. One of the most chilling aspects of the Blockbuster story is the blue graveyard effect. Across the Rust Belt and the sun-drenched suburbs of Florida, hundreds of former Blockbuster locations now house dollar stores, dental clinics, or simply remain empty, with their iconic signs removed, leaving only a faded rectangular stain on the brick. These retail ruins serve as a monument to the cost of corporate arrogance. For the towns that relied on Blockbuster as a primary employer and social anchor, the collapse was a local catastrophe, a hole in the community that no streaming algorithm could truly fill. The American industrial dream David Cook helped build was replaced by a landscape of weeds and cracked asphalt in the parking lots where families once gathered. The 2010 bankruptcy did not just kill a company, it erased a ritual. For generations, the trip to Blockbuster was how children learned to dream and how families measured their weekly progress. The emotional impact of losing that anchor is difficult to quantify in a spreadsheet, but it is felt in the silence of the malls that once vibrated with the energy of 1,000 Blockbuster moments. The sight of the blue and yellow logo being stripped from facades is a powerful image of how quickly a legacy can be overwritten when it fails to evolve. Today, we look at the plastic cases we still keep in attics as relics of a time when the world was physical, tangible, and predictable, and the loss of that world is the scar Blockbuster left on the American psyche. As we analyze the ashes of this empire, we are reminded that the same force of financial engineering and digital disruption that erased Blockbuster is currently working on today's giants. The question for the investor and the citizen is, which of today's titans is ignoring the rot in its own foundation because it is too busy protecting its short-term stock price? Blockbuster had the data, they had the money, they had the brand, but they did not have the imagination to see themselves in a future without shelves. They were victims of a narrow definition of their own purpose, believing they owned the market when they were in fact just temporary tenants of public attention. When the landlord, the American consumer, decided to move to digital, Blockbuster was left holding the bill for a feast that had already ended. The legacy of David Cook still lingers in the way we consume data today, but the industrial engine he created has stopped forever. America's suburban neighborhoods had to reinvent themselves without their Friday night anchor, a painful transition process that left many behind. The empty loading docks and silent escalators of the malls where Blockbuster reigned serve as a monument to the fact that in the high-stakes business world, the only thing more dangerous than a powerful competitor is a leadership team that believes in its own myths of invincibility. They laughed at Netflix in 2000. By 2010, no one was laughing anymore. In the final analysis, Blockbuster did not just lose a market war, it lost its identity. The blue logo still evokes nostalgic smiles, but the world it anchored has changed forever. The Blockbuster story is the ultimate American industrial tragedy. A company that taught the world how to rent dreams, but forgot how to keep its own customers dreaming. A $5 billion reminder remains that if you do not feed your business with real innovation, it will eventually begin to feed on itself. As the final lights go out on the memory of the superstores, we are left with a clinical reality. Ego and debt are the two most powerful forces of gravity in the corporate world. No matter how high you build your tower or how deep your roots go into American soil, if you stop providing value to the ticket holder, the horizon you once dominated will eventually become your graveyard. The blue ticket did not just expire, it was filed away as a cautionary tale of what happens when a legend stops listening to the heartbeat of the people it was built to serve. The social cost of Blockbuster's fall is often underestimated. It was not just the 60,000 direct jobs, but the ecosystem of suppliers, logisticians, and cleaning services that depended on those 9,000 stores. It was the end of an era of low-barrier entry employment that allowed students and part-time workers to have a connection to the cultural industry. The transition to digital may be more efficient, but it is colder, and Blockbuster was the human face of that industry. The void left by these stores contributed to the decline of suburban malls, accelerating the retail apocalypse that now haunts America. Today, the brand exists as a ghost brand, licensed for niche products and a satirical Twitter account. There is a bitter irony in the fact that the catalog model Richard Sears invented and Blockbuster perfected is now the basis of Amazon under a different name. The $100 billion potential giant has disappeared, leaving only a blue glow in the eyes of those over 40. It is a ghost of a brand that once meant security, quality, and the promise of a perfect night. As we close this autopsy, we look at the digital horizon and see new titans making the same mistakes of arrogance. Gravity always wins, and for Blockbuster, the fall was long, public, and unnecessary. The blue ticket now lies under the dust of history, a relic of a time when we thought brick-and-mortar empires were immortal. The final lesson is simple. Either you are the architect of the future, or you become a tenant of the past, and the rent of the past is always, invariably, fatal.